Animal sacrifices. We know that the avodah of karbanos, the service of sacrifices, is one of the most, one of the things concerning which Chazal say the world stands on it, the world depends on it. And the question becomes, what's the deal with bringing karbanos in the absence of a Beis Hamikdash? This came up actually this week, somewhat in the Rambam study, both in the cycle of one parak and in the study of 3 prakim, as we'll see soon. So I figured it was an appropriate week to discuss it. Akiva, would you be so kind as to close the sliding door? So, first of all, one of the questions is, historically, were karbanos ever brought in absence of the Beis Hamikdash, meaning in between the destruction of the first and the second temple, and after the destruction of the second temple, did they ever bring karbanos? The Gemara tells a story which was quoted in which the Rambam quotes the halacha aspect of this, the halachic ramifications of this story in the laws of Kiddush and Chedesh in chapter 4, which the study of one cycle, one parak, a day of Rambam studied this past week. That says as follows: Rabbi Gamliel was sitting on a step in the Har HaBayis, and Yochanan Sofer, the scribe Yochanan, we have our own scribe Yochanan, but this was a different scribe Yochanan, was standing in front of him, and he had 3 pages prepared, 3 letters. And Rabbi Gamliel told the scribe to send these 3 letters, to one of them to Bavel, the other one to Madai, and the other to all the other exiles of Israel, and to write Shlom Chan Yasker, you should, peace unto you. We are letting you know that because the birds are still young and the sheep are still soft or still young, so we need to give them extra time, and the time of the spring has not yet come, therefore it has been agreed upon to myself and my colleagues to add 30 days onto this year's calendar. What that means is like this: nowadays we have a fixed calendar, but in this time, Rabbi Gamliel is the Nasi, he's the prince, he's the leader of the Sanhedrin, and they were still at a time when they were being Mekadosh the Chodesh al Pi HaRe'iyah, when they were sanctifying the new moon based on the testimony of 2 witnesses. And then there was also the question of a leap year. Now in our fixed calendar, we have a very fixed system. 7 out of every 19 years are leap years, and it's all preset. But in the time when they were Mekadosh al Pi HaRe'iyah, every year the Bezdin, before they would sanctify the new moon on the month, for the month of Adar, they would publicize which is next Adar, is the coming month the only Adar, and the following month will then be Nisan. Or are we calling the next month Adar 1, and there will be an extra 30 days, which at least nowadays we call Adar 1 and Adar 2. So in this particular instance, Rabbi Gamliel was notifying all the communities throughout the world that because the sheep are not yet too young or too soft, whatever it is, and also the birds, therefore we are postponing Pesach. And he says the time of the spring has not yet come, so there's no need to rush. So we're postponing Pesach another 30 days. We're adding a second month of Adar. Now the Rambam, when he quotes this halacha, he says that the sheep and the birds, that wouldn't have been a reason in and of itself to add another month. That was just used as a sa'ad, as an additional reason. The primary reason was the fact that it wasn't yet the spring. Now, this Gemara was presented to Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who is the father of the Chacham Tzvi, I think, or the son of the Chacham Tzvi, and the son. Yeah, so Rabbi Yaakov Emden lived a few hundred years ago, and the correspondent of the Rabbi Yaakov Emden was asking him, surely this was after the destruction of the temple, so this would seem to imply that they were already bringing karbanos that they were still bringing karbanos after the destruction of the second temple. Now, essentially, what this argument boils down to is which Rabbi Gamliel was this? There were, I think, 3 Rabbi Gamliels. Means Rabbi Gamliel, then his grandson was Rabbi Gamliel, and his grandson was Rabbi Gamliel. But specifically, the question, and in the Tshuva of Rabbi Akiva, and in the writings of those who discussed this afterwards, it basically boils down to what the correct girsa of the Gemara is over there. Is it talking about the one who we call Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne? For those who were attending the Gemara class before Corona, we discussed the whole story of Rabbi Gamliel, who was the Nasi, and he did something which is he humiliated Rabbi Yeshua, and then he was demoted, and they put Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in his place, and he had the miracle of growing the 18 strands of white hair in his beard overnight. And then Rabbi Gamliel was reinstated, and the final arrangement was that Rabbi Gamliel had 3 weeks, and he had 1 week, or he had 2 weeks, and he had 1 week, whatever it was. Okay, so that was Rabbi Gamliel the Yavne. Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne was the Nasi after he was alive during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, but he was the Nasi. He was the leader of the Sanhedrin after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. The Rabbi Gamliel Hazakin, who's the grandfather of Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne, was in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. So the person who posed this question to Rabbi Akiva, he was convinced, based on his proofs, that the Gemara is talking about Rabbi Gamliel the Yavne, and therefore he said this seems to be proof that they were bringing the Karban Pesach after the destruction of the temple. Now, those who disagree with him, the Maratz Chayes and others, they try to strengthen or establish the gears in the Gemara that actually it's talking about the grandfather of Rabbi Gamliel the Yavne, Rabbi Gamliel Hazakin, and in that case, this Gemara doesn't even pose any precedent to the idea of bringing karbanos after the time of the Beis Hamikdash. So this is the Gemara this is the first, perhaps the first glimpse that we have that maybe there is room to bring karbanos nowadays. Even if you say you can bring karbanos nowadays, we don't necessarily know which karbanos. We know Rabbi Gamliel is talking about making the year a leap year, so he's talking about Pesach, but he also mentions the birds. Birds, the important, that's very important, because in the discussion about this throughout the ages, the discussion primarily revolves about karbanos tzibur, the public offering. So there was the daily carbon tamid, which was carbon for the whole community, for the tzibur, etc. The birds were only brought as a carbon yachid, as a carbon of an individual. There could be many reasons why somebody would bring a bird carbon. Most commonly, it was for a woman who had given birth, or for a woman who was a zava, which was an unusual menstrual cycle, or there could have been other reasons for certain transgressions that a person did. But birds are not brought by the tzibur, by the community, only by individuals. So from the fact that Rabbi Gamliel mentions birds over here, it would suggest that he's not talking about bringing karbanos in the absence of a Beis Hamikdash, because even those who do allow bringing karbanos in the absence of Beis Hamikdash are only referring to karbanos tzibur, to communal offerings, with the exception of Karban Pesach, which, even though that's an individual offering, every individual brings a Karban Pesach, it's considered a Karban tzibur as far as this is concerned, and we'll get to Karban Pesach soon. But so that's one of the problems with this Gemara, that though the Maratz Chayes says, how could you use this Gemara as a precedent to say that you could bring karbanos even in absence of a Beis Hamikdash? Certainly, in mentioning birds, it's obvious that he's talking even about karbanos yachid, and therefore you have to say one of two things. Either you have to say that this was Rabbi Gamliel Hazakin, and this occurred in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, in which case the whole passage of the Gemara is irrelevant to our discussion. Or Rabbi Akiva suggests another reason, that Rabbi Gamliel was optimistic and hoping that the Beis Hamikdash would very speedily be rebuilt, and in which case, if they delay Pesach for another month, then the sheep will have time to mature, and in the meantime, perhaps the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, and will be able to bring karbanos, but not necessarily that karbanos not they could bring the karban Pesach in absence of the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Yaakov Emden himself prefers the first reason. It's also important to note that the Rambam, when he introduces the concept of Mashiach, and in the second to last chapter of the whole book of Yad HaChazaka, he writes that Malach HaMashiach, what's he going to do? He says he's going to reestablish the kingdom of David, and all the mitzvahs will return in his day, Makriv and karbanos, and will bring karbanos. So the Rambam seems to imply that Mashiach is going to reinstate karbanos, and that it can't happen before Mashiach. But those who are pro the karbanos without the temple will say that the Rambam is referring to the individual karbanos. For those, you have to wait for the Beis Hamikdash. But the karbanos tzibur, the communal offerings, those do not need to wait for the Beis Hamikdash. Those are individual. Personal? Yeah, those are all personal. The communal ones are the daily ones, the karban tamid, the musaf ones for Shabbos, for Chodesh, Yom Tov, etc.
So even those stopped at time of the destruction of the temple?
Well, that's the discussion. Was there any continuation? There's certainly, I think it's quite obvious that it wasn't continued on a daily meeting, considered on a daily, that wasn't possible. But perhaps at times when the occupying government was friendlier, they could have gotten away with certain things. They certainly couldn't have gotten away with bringing karbanos, multiple karbanos every day. But the question is, was there any continuation of karbanos in absence of the Beis Hamikdash? Yeah, we're going to get to the location in a moment. There's also another story in the Gemara which talks about Rabbi Gamliel telling his servant Tavi. Tavi was a famous story, a servant of Rabbi Gamliel, slave of Rabbi Gamliel. There's numerous stories throughout Shas about Tavi. And there's one story where the Mishnah says that Rabbi Gamliel sent Tavi as an agent, as a messenger, to go and shech the karban Pesach for him, to bring his karban Pesach to the Beis Hamikdash. And again, Rabbi Yaakov Emden is quite convinced that that's referring to Rabbi Gamliel the Yavne, and that this happened after the destruction. Those who are against karbanos bisman hazeh, they'll either say that that's talking about a different Rabbi Gamliel, or even if it is Rabbi Gamliel the Yavne, it was earlier on in his life, before he assumed the leadership, in his younger years, when the Beis Hamikdash was still standing. Now, okay, the next, there's another source. This is a very important source, which, as we'll see soon, the Rebbe had in because a little bit of history, the Lubavitch history. In 1967, there was the miraculous victory of the Six-Day War, in which the IDF secured sovereignty over the Temple Mount. The following year, on the last day of Pesach, on Achron Shel Pesach, 1968, Toshin Chav Ches, the Rebbe spoke about the fact that because, according to one opinion, there is a possibility to bring a karban Pesach nowadays, and because of the severity of karban Pesach being kares, therefore people should leave Jerusalem for Pesach Sheni. So let's unpack that a little bit. Some mitzvahs in the Torah are punishable by kares, by excision, being cut off, which the Rambam says meant that a person died before the age of 50 or 60, or that he died without children. And famously, the Alter Rebbe in Igeres HaTeshuvah speaks about why nowadays we see people transgressing kares prohibitions and yet living many long, happy years. Okay, now any Aveira that has the punishment of kares, the Mishnah says there's 36 Aveiras, desecrating Shabbos, incest, many others. Because of that, those Aveiras are considered extra severe. Now, all of the Aveiras which incur kares are negative commandments. Again, desecrating Shabbos, incest, idolatry, all those type of things, with the exception of two. There are two positive commandments that failure to do them, to fulfill them, incurs karis. One is circumcision, and the second is Pesach. So what the Rebbe was suggesting was that because according to Rabbi Chiel or Rabbi Hananel of Paris, when we can bring karbanos nowadays, we're going to see what this Rabbi Chiel of Paris says in a moment. So even though the Rebbe says Rabu ha'isrim, the majority opinion disagrees with this opinion of Rabbi Chiel of Paris, and we'll see soon why Rabbi Chiel of Paris is a lone voice. But because such an opinion does exist, and because this is not just any mitzvah, this is a Karban Pesach, which is chiyuv kares. It's punishable by kares in neglect to do so. So nowadays, after the victory of the 6-Day War, where we have access to the Harabais, and according to Rabbi Chiel of Paris, we would be chayiv kares if we don't do it, but we can't actually do it because of all the reasons why, all the opinions who disagree with Rabbi Chiel, as we'll see in a moment. So therefore, the Rebbe suggested that everybody should leave Yerushalayim. Now, when it comes to the Karban Pesach, there is a special din called derech choika, that if somebody is more than 15 mil, which is about 15 kilometers, outside of Yerushalayim, they are exempt from Pesach, and therefore the Rebbe says everybody should leave Yerushalayim. And in this case, the Rebbe was talking on the last day of Pesach, so it had the first opportunity to do so was on Erev Pesach in 1968, because the 6-Day War was in June of 1967, June or July, right? So the Rebbe didn't address this at all before Pesach. The Rebbe mentioned it in a Farbrengen on the last day of Pesach concerning Pesach Sheni. We know the halacha is that if somebody misses Pesach, the first Pesach, then there is the makeup Pesach a month later. So the Rebbe was suggesting that people should leave Yerushalayim for the second Pesach. Okay, we'll get more to the Rebbe's, to that whole discussion, the post-6-Day War application of all of this later on. So now let's see what Rabbi Chiel of Paris says. Now, Rabbi Chiel of Paris is quoted in a sefer called Kafte V'Ferach. Kafte V'Ferach, the author, his name is Reb Ishturi HaParchi. The Ishturi HaParchi. He was the first. He lived. Let's see when he lived. It was in the time of the Rishonim, so he was quite a while ago. Let's say between 700 and 1,000 years ago. And he was one of the first people who went to try and, without the evidence and the study of archaeology and everything, he spent a lot of time traveling Eretz Yisrael and analyzing things and trying to figure out many, many things about the history about Nach. So, for example, in Sefer Yehoshua and Shoftim, you have all the lists of different cities, dozens of cities. He tried to figure out where all these cities are. And you had the borders of Israel that are described in Parshas Masei and in the book of Yehoshua. He tried to figure out exactly where they are. And he is the pioneer of this discussion, even contemporarily. Now, contemporarily, we have a lot more resources than he did. We have archaeology. He didn't have any of that. But still, much of what he wrote and said still carries a lot of weight in these discussions. And there's numerous halachic ramifications. Just for example, it's coming up next year is the Shemitah year. So produce that grows within the boundaries of Israel, within the borders of Israel, has the status of Shemitah. Where is this, for example, one of the biggest controversies when it comes to Shemitah is where exactly is the halachic southern border of Israel, right? So the Kafte V'Ferach is one of the important sources when it comes to this. So in Kafte V'Ferach, he records a discussion that he had with an individual by the name of Reb Baruch in Yerushalayim, that Reb Hananel of Paris, and some say it was Rabbi Chiel of Paris, whoever this person was, that he wanted to come to Yerushalayim in the year 5017. Now we're 5780. So this is just about 750 years ago. So 750 years ago, Rabbi Chiel of Paris wanted to come to Eretz Yisrael and bring karbanos. And the author of Kafte V'Ferach records that I didn't get a chance to ask him, what will we do about the fact that we are all Tomei and on a Kohen Miyuchas, and we don't have a Kohen Miyuchas? So those are the first two issues, which we don't have an answer to. We know that Rabbi Chiel of Paris wanted to do this, the Kafta V'Ferach records that he doesn't know what Rabbi Chil would have done with the following two questions. Number one, we are all tummy. We are all, because we don't have the ashes of the red heifer, so we are all, everyone has pretty much come in contact within, it doesn't mean that you've touched a dead body. If you've come within 6 feet of a grave, then you're tummy. And we don't have access to a paraduma. So that's one question. The second question is ana kohen miyuchas, and that's based on the assumption, which is certainly the simple reading of the Gemara and the Rambam, that in order to have the absolute status of a kohen, to be able, as far as biblical things are concerned, to be able to consume teruma, to be able to bring karbanos on the mizbeach, any of those things which the Torah mandates a kohen, you need to have a kohen meyuchas. You need to have a kohen whom we have absolute proven sort of his family tree, his genealogy, that he traces himself to Aaron HaKohen. And nowadays, all the kohenim that are nowadays considered kohenim are only kohenei chazaka. And so, which means that we consider them kohenim because they have a chazaka, they have a sort of a status quo that they are kohenim, and that's good enough to allow them to duchen, and it's even good enough to allow them to get the first aliyah and any of those things, but it's not good enough for them to be serving in the temple. So the Kafta V'Ferach says, I didn't get a chance to ask Reb Baruch, this Reb Baruch from Yerushalayim tells the author of the Kafta V'Ferach that I did not get a chance to ask Rabbi Chil of Paris what he would have done with these two problems, but I know that Rabbi Chil of Paris wanted to do this, and for whatever reason, it didn't work out. By the way, sorry, yes?
There are people that can trace their Kohanim back that far?
Are there anyone nowadays who can? That's a kind of a discussion, and there's a lot of literature on that. The common opinion nowadays is that all Kohanim are only considered Kohenei Chazaka, and that when Mashiach comes, Eliyahu Hanavi will sort of reinstate who is confirmed the Kohen. By the way, there's another big problem with the whole status of Kohen now, which became very relevant in the last 50, 60, 70 years, and that is that there are many people who are considered Kohenim, right? Why are they Kohenim? Because my father was a Kohen, my grandfather was a Kohen. But because so many people had left an observant way of life, and now in this generation, the resurgence of the Baal Shuvah movement becomes two problems. Number one, if the father is not if he's not Shomer Shabbos, so he's not a kosher witness, right? So when you have a not kosher witness, it's not that we don't believe him, it's just that Torah doesn't consider him a kosher witness, right? If you would have somebody who's non-religious, a witness for a wedding ceremony, it would be an invalid wedding, not because we don't believe him that the chassan put the ring on the kala's finger, just because he's an invalid witness. So one question becomes, if the father was not religious, does the fact that he says that he, quote, testifies that he's a Kohen, do we reckon is that admissible evidence? That's one question. The other question is that, and this is not across anyone who's not religious, but certainly can be a big problem, a big concern in many cases, is that even if we verify 100% and we believe the father that he is a Kohen, if the mother of the Kohen, or the wife of the Kohen, or the mother of the Kohen, had at any point in her life before getting married to this Kohen lived with a non-Jewish man, right? So she was promiscuous in college or anything like that, then her children, then she may not marry a Kohen, and if she does, the children are considered halalim, they are not kosher Kohens. So I actually personally know of somebody who became frum and he was a Kohen and he used to duchen, and then he found out about his mother's lifestyle when she was a single girl, and he stopped, and he's no longer a Kohen. He never was. He thought he was, but he's actually not. He thought he was because his father is a Kohen, right? And in fact, there's dozens and hundreds of people like that out there. And this particular individual that I know is actually married to a woman who a Kohen would not be allowed to marry. He's married to a convert. But anyway, so those are the first two issues we have over here. Is if we got to bring karbanos nowadays, what are we going to do with the fact that we don't have a kain miyuchas, and what are we going to do with the fact that we are all impure? Now, in the years. Okay. Throughout the generations of exile, there has been many different governments ruling over the land of Israel. There was the Turks. There was a brief time, which we're going to talk about, which the following occurred in when Egypt was ruling over Israel. Then it went back to the Turks. Then I'm not exactly familiar with all the history. Then it was the British until 1948. Now, in the year, just a moment, let me find this page, the right page over here. There was a Rav, perhaps he can be called the original pioneer of any Zionist movement, religious Zionist movement. There was a big Rav, a Talmud Chacham by the name of Reb Tzvi Kalisher, who was a student of Rabbi Akiva Eger. Just a moment. Tzvi Kalisher was a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva Eger. Rabbi Akiva Eger is one of the most prominent Achronim, and his both in his commentary on the Gemara and in his Chuvas and his halachic rulings. And Tzvi Kalisher corresponded about this with Rabbi Akiva Eger, and then Rabbi Akiva Eger handed it over to his son-in-law, also very important, Pesach the Chassam Sefer. Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher outlived both of them, and he published the sefer called Rishas Tzion. He published the sefer. This is obviously a reprint of it, but he published it in the year Tafresh Chav Beis, that is 1862. He published this book, which was after the passing both of the Rabbi Akiva Eger and the Chassam Sefer. And basically, Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher believed, and he demonstrated this based on his understanding of numerous statements of Chazal and Gemara and Midrashim, etc., that Mashiach can't come and won't come just, quote, out of nowhere. The way Mashiach has to come is that the Jewish people have to, on their own, reinstate the service of the temple, not to build the temple, but reinstate the service of the karbanos. And in so doing, that will already invoke the beginning of the process, which will bring Eliyahu Hanavi, which will bring Mashiach, which will complete this, the building of the Beis Hamikdash, and the full redemption. Yes, so he believed that it is incumbent upon the Jewish people, and that it is a necessary component to the process of the revelation of Mashiach for us to go and start bringing karbanos. And this is what he started communicating with to Rabbi Akiva Eger, to his Rebbe, and then following afterwards to the Chassam Sefer, and also and later published this book called Rishas Tzion. Now it's interesting that part of in the year Tov Kuf Tzadik Vav, that's 1820 or 1836. In the year 1836, he wrote a letter to Baron Rothschild, Angel Rothschild, who was the very wealthy, affluent, and influential person. He lived in Frankfurt, in Germany, and he was throughout the world one of the most influential people in the world, and one of the most wealthy, and he himself was a God-fearing, observant Jew, Baron Rothschild. And he was a tremendous Baal Tzedakah. He gave a lot of charity. Actually, Baron Rothschild died in the year 1812. No, it can't be. Sorry, that's his father. He died in the year 1855. And he never had any children. But in the year, like I said, in 1795, no, what am I, Tzadik Vav is 20. 1820, 30, 1835. 1836, Reb Tzvi Kalisher wrote a letter to Baron Rothschild, a very long letter, in which he starts off the letter by going through all the halachic. First, he starts his letter with demonstrating his opinion, again based on the midrashim, etc., that this is the way Mashiach has to come. Then he goes to address the halachic questions, and then he concludes the letter by basically asking Baron Rothschild to basically go to the ruler of Egypt at the time, which was the ruler of Egypt at the time was, hold on, Muhammad Ali, who was the ruler of Egypt from 1832 to 1840, right? And he basically pleads with Baron Rothschild to buy Israel, to buy the land of Israel. Then he says, if not the whole land of Israel, at least Jerusalem. If not Jerusalem, at least the Temple Mount. And if not buy it, at least get permission for it, get the Egyptian monarch to give us permission to use it. And he really tries very hard to think. We do not have any record of Baron Rothschild ever responding to this letter. And as the authors, producers of this book point out, that although Baron Rothschild was well known for his generosity in charity, he is not well known for supporting any causes in Israel per se. We do not know him. Now, actually, they produced over here, I'll show you, in the back of this book, they have a copy, facsimile, whatever you say. This is the handwriting, the letter of Rabbi Tzvi Kalisha to Baron Rothschild. Yeah, so very interesting letter. You don't have to read it from here. You could, in the book, they actually have it typed up. But okay, so what are the primary? Oh, by the way, another very important source. Okay, we'll get to that in a moment. Basically, there's four issues that have to be addressed about bringing karbanos nowadays. Two of them we've mentioned. Well, 5 issues really. 2 of them we've mentioned. Having a legitimate kohen and the fact that we are all impure. Another problem is making the bigdei kahuna, making the garments that a kohen needs to wear. We'll see soon. Another is identifying the correct place for the mizbeach. And another is whether or not we can the place of the mizbeach, the place of the Beis Hamikdash retains its sanctity nowadays. You know, you have to bring a carbon in the place of the Beis Hamikdash, even though there's no structure of the Beis Hamikdash. Does that geographical location still retain its sanctity? So the Rambam writes in Hilchos Beis HaBechira that 3 prophets two important quotes in the Rambam Beis HaBechira. Number 1 is in chapter 2. He writes that the place of the Mizbeach is absolutely mechuvan. It's exact, and it's the place. He writes that's the exact place where Adam Rishon was created from, and that's the place where the Akedah took place, or the binding of Isaac. And he says that when the Jewish people came up from the Goyla, that means with the Second Commonwealth, when Ezra and his colleagues Chagus Chaim Malachi came up from Bavel to build they built the second temple, there were 3 prophets, and one of them testified that one may bring karbanos even in absence of the Beis Hamikdash, right? And the other was that one may bring karbanos, and the second one, it says there's 3, but the 2 that are relevant are, the second one testified for where the exact location of the Mizbeach is. So on the one hand, we know that according to the Rambam, we can technically bring karbanos even in the absence of a Beis Hamikdash, but we also know that we need to know exactly where the Mizbeach is. The Rambam writes later on in Hilchos Beis HaBechira in Perek Vav, he writes that the sanctity of the Beis Hamikdash remains, and even though the structure of Hashimosis Mikdashechem, the pasuk says, even if it's destroyed, the sanctity still remains. And however, the Ravid, who we know the Ravid is always the one who argues with the Rambam, the Ravid writes that no, the sanctity of the Beis Mikdash does not remain, and there's no sanctity in that place anymore. We mentioned this Ravid before. A few months ago, we had the classes about prophecy in halacha. So one of the relevant sources was this particular Ravid, where he says, "How do I know that nowadays there's no sanctity to the Beis Hamikdash? This is what I was revealed to me in private communication by Hashem," basically a free translation. And elsewhere, the Rambam writes, when concerning the law of Hadassim, where he writes that we had, by divine inspiration, we know the halacha of this case, and we discussed that at great length some weeks ago. So this is one of the times where the Ravid, some don't take the Ravid at face value. Some say the Ravid doesn't mean to say literally that this was divine inspiration, but some others do take it literally, and again, we discussed that in the past. Now, the irony is, the Rambam is saying, so according to the Rambam, it seems that if we could address all of the other issues, we would be able to bring a carbon nowadays, because even though there's no Mizbeach, even though there's no Beis HaMikdash, the sanctity still remains. The irony is, and this Reb Tzvi Kalisher makes this point, that you could do so, there's nothing to lose according to the Ravid. Why can't I bring a carbon over here in Chicago? Because once the Beis HaMikdash was sanctified, it became forbidden to bring a carbon anywhere else outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Reb Tzvi Kalisher argues that according to the Ravid, there would be no point in bringing a carbon nowadays, but there also wouldn't be anything wrong with it. You wouldn't be, right? If the Beis HaMikdash has its sanctity and you bring a carbon in the wrong place, so then that's also a chiyuv kares, actually. Yeah, that's a severe prohibition. But if he argues that according to the Ravid, where there's no sanctity of the Beis HaMikdash, so then at least you have nothing to lose. So according to the Rambam, there's everything to gain, and he argues that according to the Ravid, there's nothing to lose. As you can imagine, many would say that no, then even according to the Ravid, even though it doesn't retain its sanctity, but the prohibition still remains. And of course, every single one of the points that we're mentioning now, just sort of giving you an overview of the topics, you can imagine that in all the polemics and literature about this, there's much debate about all of these points.
When they say bring Corbin, are they kind of bringing it to the Temple Mount right now, or?
Yes.
Okay. In this passage, Parsha, we're talking about when Moses was brought into the basket and put into the river. There's an argument that it couldn't have been put into the river. He had to be put on the river bank because the river Nile was considered that because of the way the Egyptians considered the river, and but then it said that that when the daughter came down, to cleanse herself, it was also a spiritual cleansing. She was, and because of that, then the Nile could be used for that. Okay, so my point is that how can we talk about bringing it to the Temple Mount when right this minute it's being used for another religious purpose, another religion's purpose?
Yes, so there's no question that the fact that the Temple Mount is defiled, I mean, that's part of the Golus, that's part of the Churban, and in fact that becomes, there were those who argued that after the establishment of the state, and certainly after the victory of the 6-Day War, that the text of the bracha of Nachem on Tisha B'Av, where we talk about the desolate and destroyed city, where we should change that bracha, but the majority of halachic of poskim were against the change, And one of the points they made, I think Rabbi Yosef makes this point, that what do you mean? Like, what could be more destruction than a mosque on the place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, right? That's part of the Churban, and that's something that Mashiach only Mashiach can rectify, but that doesn't necessarily, as much as that disturbs us, it doesn't exempt us. If there is a halachic obligation and possibility to bring karbanos, then we can't circumvent that just because it's uncomfortable because there's a mosque over there.
Well, is it a question of being uncomfortable, or is it a question of being this? It cannot be accepted at that place because it has been defiled.
No, the Rambam is arguing that no matter what happens on the place, even the geographic location of the Beis HaMikdash and of the Mizbeach retains its sanctity. Now, let's move on to those things. So we've spoken about whether or not the sanctity of the Mizbeach nowadays. We said the Rambam says there is. Now, the second problem is to identify the exact location of the Mizbeach, which, like the Rambam says, is very precise. Now, this is a very complicated discussion. There are 4 or 5 opinions as to exactly where the Temple Mount. If you look for further research, if you look on what's that website called, where they have the JLI stuff, Torah, not Torah, is it Torah.net? No. Anyway, Google it. There's at one of the JLI retreats, there was a Rabbi Mendy Blau who did a very nice presentation on all the different opinions of where exactly the Beis HaMikdash and the Mizbeach was. And we actually had a couple of years ago, Rabbi Schechter from the Mesivta came here and did a little bit of a class on that too. But anyway, Rabbi Tzvi Kalisha says, well, we know where the western wall of the temple is, and so we know the measurements based on the Rambam and based on the Mishnah Samidus exactly where the Mizbeach is, and therefore we could figure out the exact spot of the Mizbeach. I'm not going to get into all the details right now, but suffice it to say that and again, like I said, there's that video you can watch. You can see all the different complications. Any which way you go, there's always going to be other opinions as to where the Mizbeach, first of all, the western wall itself, Rabbi Tzvi Kalisha probably didn't know this, but now that we have the archaeology, we know the western wall itself is hundreds of feet long. So where exactly in the west, there's so many different possibilities of where to figure out where things are, that it becomes very difficult to use the kaisel as an exact measuring spot. An alternative suggestion was made to use the Evan HaShasiyah. That means in the mosque there's a rock which many consider to be the rock that was in the Holy of Holies, and to measure from there. Again, it becomes difficult. One of the main difficulties is that the rock that's there is 18 by 13 meters, which is much bigger than the dimensions of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So is that the rock that was in the Evan HaShasiyah? Is it not? Bottom line is that, again, this is a multiple way machlokes, but there is no clear, definitive decision which everyone can agree on as to where the Mizbeach is. There is some discussion, actually, it's interesting. Is it possible to get all the opinions together? Again, the Mizbeach was 32 amos long and wide, which is 32 amos is about 50 feet, right? It's a very big structure. So can you narrow it down to a particular couple of feet, which everyone would agree that was part of the Mizbeach, right? So that becomes part of the discussion. Again, complicated whether or not you could actually do that, and even if you can.
Since the second temple was larger,
it was the second.
It was larger. Did the dimensions change? It was the exact same spot.
It was both. It was the Mizbeach in the second temple was in the exact same spot as the first temple, plus an additional, I think it was 2 amos or whatever it was. Right. So we need to find that spot. Okay. So that's another one of the problems. Now the next problem is okay. So the easiest problem to resolve, and we also had this in the Rambam last week of the 3-parak cycle, that tuma dechuya betzibur, that for communal sacrifices such as the daily offerings and for the Karban Pesach, tuma is dechuya. That means that if the majority of the community, or as the fact is nowadays, the entire community are impure, are tamei, so then that overrides, even though in general there's a prohibition to enter the Temple Mount with impurity and there's a prohibition to eat sacrificial meats with impurity, etc., etc. But if everybody is tamei, then that becomes overridden. And so nowadays, because everybody is tamei, and this is the point that Psiyush Kalisha, one of the points that Psiyush Kalisha makes, and that seems to be quite pretty much agreeable to everybody, that indeed nowadays, because everybody is tamei, so it's okay to bring a karban. Now, then, okay, so we spoke about bringing, finding a kohen miyuchas. Oh, so how do you deal with the kohen miyuchas? So Tzirsh Kalish's approach to the whole thing is that actually he tries to demonstrate, and again, he brings proof from this Gemara, you could proof from another Gemara, as we know how these discussions go, but Tzirsh Kalish tries to prove and demonstrate that the kohenim nowadays are good enough, and they will continue to be kosher kohenim even when we have karbanos, and all the references in the Gemaras and the Rambams that you need more evidence than that was only, he says two things. First of all, in that particular case, the primary example is Ezra. That when Ezra came up to the second the second Commonwealth, so there were many kohenim who were disqualified because they didn't have the ksav miyuchas, they didn't have their family tree to prove it. So he says two things. First of all, there was a reya, so that means that the kohenim had, many of the kohenim families had intermarried into non-Jewish families in Bavel. So it wasn't just like, oh, go prove you're a kohen. There was a reason to assume that they weren't, because they hadn't kept the boundaries properly. So that was A. And B, he says, and again he demonstrates this, that there's a difference between, at a time when there are kohenim who have a ksav miyuchas, so then you could choose to say that the kohenim who don't have it are not good enough. But in a time when no one has it, so then if you're not going to choose, then if you're not going to rely on their word that they're kohenim, then you're never going to have any kohenim. And he proves, he says this is not something that Eliyahu Hanavi will ever change. And he go again, that's his whole thing. The question then becomes about the question becomes about bigdei kahuna. We need to have the priestly garments, right? So we don't need a kohen gadol. We don't need to worry with the 8 garments, but we need the 4 garments of the kohen hedyot, which are the shirt, the pants, the hat, and the belt. Now, the biggest problem with all of these things is the belt, and there's 2 problems with the belt. Number one, there's a machloikus that means like this: the belt of the kohen gadol includes wool and linen, which is shatnez, which that was allowed for that. But there's a machloikus tanaim. There's a machloikus tanaim whether or not the belt of the kohen hedyot is the same as the kohen gadol or not. So that's one thing which we have to know whether or not we have a halachic, an absolute ruling for. And the bigger problem is the problem of techelas, because if we assume that, right? The halacha is that we paskin, the Rambam paskins that the belt of the kohen hedyot is the same as the belt of the kohen gadol, and because of that, we need to have techelas. Now, nowadays, we have pretty much techelas, even though the Chabad custom is not to wear techelas as part of the tzitzis, but that doesn't mean to say that we necessarily that the proofs that have been brought that the techelas that they have today is not the accurate techelas, right? There's no reason to assume otherwise. In fact, just very, very briefly, the history is that there was the first person to try and reinstate techelas was the Radziner Rebbe, Rabbi Leifer, and his son was corresponded about it with the Rebbe Rashab, and he believed that the techelas was the cuttlefish. And the Rebbe Rashab writes in his letter where he says that the Rebbe Rashab says that why we would not accept, why we won't institute wearing tchelas in the tzitzis, but he doesn't negate the possibility that the cuttlefish is tchelas. He says it may very well be, and he says, I think I may have even seen a cuttlefish once in an aquarium, and he's not against it. So nowadays it's pretty much been proven beyond any reasonable doubt that the I forget the exact name of the snail that's considered the chilazin, which provides the blue for the tchelas. So they would use that. However, of course, in the time of Reb Tzvi's Kalisha, they did not have that. So he tried to demonstrate, again, this gets into the whole thing in the Rambam, because when the Rambam talks about tchelas in the laws of tzitzis, he talks about bringing this chilazin fish, etc. When he talks about tchelas in the laws of the priestly garments, he just says tchelas is wool that's dyed in the color of the etzem hashamayim, of the sky, and it's, he describes the color. So Reb Tzvi's Kalisha argues that the tchelas for the priestly garments doesn't have to be chilazin, it can just be any, as long as it's the same color, blue, it doesn't matter what the source of the dye is. So that's how he got around that issue.
But how do they define the actual shade of blue?
So the Rambam describes how it's lighter than this and it's darker than that. I guess again I haven't read the whole book, but he's convinced that, and as long as it doesn't have to be exact. I mean, blue. As long as it's blue, it's fine. Okay. Okay, so that's basically the very brief overview of the whole sort of the history of the topic and the various issues and the questions and the possible answers. I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what happened in the 60s and the 70s with the Rebbe's thing about leaving Yerushalayim. Essentially, look, before I started reading this in the last few days, I was under the impression that the Rebbe gave an instruction that everybody should leave Yerushalayim. As the more I'm reading it, it doesn't seem that the Rebbe actually gave such an instruction in strict, strong terms. It was more of a sort of a suggestion. It's something that the Rebbe mentioned one time in public on Achron Shal Pesach of 1968, and never mentioned it again. And that was it. Now, in the context of the Rebbe's Farbrengen, the Rebbe wasn't talking about, he didn't get into all these details. The chiddush, the primary novelty in the Rebbe's suggestion was that it applies to Pesach Sheni as well. And what followed was a very, very interesting correspondence with Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin. Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin was a tremendous Talmid Chacham who was originally from a Chabad origin in Babroisk in Belarus. And then he came to Eretz Yisrael, and he was the pioneer and the founder of the Encyclopedia Talmudis project, which is a project that the Rebbe very much cherished. And there's dozens, maybe even hundreds, but certainly dozens of letters from the Rebbe to him and back, published in Igros Kodesh. They had a very, very extensive correspondence with the Rebbe. So the Rebbe, after this Sikha of Achron Shal Pesach 1968, he wrote a letter to the Rebbe with 5 very, again, he was an absolute genius Talmid Chacham, and he has 5 very strong questions on the Rebbe's, on this whole idea. 4 out of the 5 questions are questioning the whole notion that this would apply to Pesach Sheni. But he does also ask, maybe 3 of them. He asks, why only Pesach Sheni? Why not Pesach? And the Rebbe says, yes, absolutely, Pesach as well. So even though the Rebbe didn't speak about it before the first Pesach after the 6-day war, but and the Rebbe, and then he also asks, what about all the generations until now? And the Rebbe says, well, the generations until now didn't exactly have the opportunity to do it. It's only in light of the victory of the 6-day war that this has even come into question. It's when you have the possibility, then if you are obligated to do it, there's a chiyuv kares. If you don't have the possibility, then you don't have thing. Now the Rebbe made it very clear to him in a number of places in this letter that the Rebbe is not suggesting that we paskin this way, that like Rabbi Chiel. The Rebbe says, Rabbi Ha'istrim, it seems the vast majority opinion is that's forbidden to bring karbanos nowadays. But because the severity of Pesach is a chiyuv kares, so so we should be super duper extra strict. Now, then what happened was on Yud Gimel Iyar, it's interesting, Tashin Lamed Hey, 7 years later, 1975, on Yud Gimel Iyar, which is the day before Pesach Sheni, the Rabbi wrote another letter to Rabbi Zevin saying that, as has become evident over the time since the 6-Day War, don't forget this letter was written after the Yom Kippur War, 1975, yeah? But as has become evident that actually the Israeli government are very keen to demonstrate that we are allowing the Arabs to live in peace and that we are not exercising our authority and dominion over the Temple Mount. So it's become clear that it is no longer possible, and so no need to leave Yerushalayim anymore. And from then on, nobody had to left Yerushalayim anymore. I wonder, I don't know, this letter was dated on the day before Pesach Sheni. I assume it didn't become known until at least a week or so later when the letter arrived in Israel. Be that as it may, one of the questions that Rabbi Zevin starts off his letter with is that how do you want thousands of people to leave Yerushalayim? Well, and the Rabbi says, well, it's not such a big deal. First of all, it's only for a few hours, and it's only the people over Bar and Bas Mitzvah, and that's for the first Pesach. For Pesach Sheni, it's only the men, because women are obligated to do the first Pesach, but for the second Pesach, women are only optional. So for the first Pesach, everyone will have to leave. For the Pesach Sheni, it'll be the second, only the men, and only for a few hours, and so it's no big deal. And at the very least, the Rebbe says, the Rebbe's not insisting that you must do it, I just think it's a good idea. And at the very least, other people who don't live in Yerushalayim should see to it that they don't come to visit Yerushalayim on those days. Now, as much as the Rebbe is saying it's not such a big deal, the author of this article that I was using interviewed some of the people who lived in Yerushalayim at the time, and actually it was a very big deal. First of all, if you're talking about Pesach, so that means you can't be in Yerushalayim from midday on Erev Pesach until the Seder night. Those are the hours of the Karban Pesach. So if you have family who live in Sfas or Kfar Chabad or whatever, who have a big enough home to host you, so then you could pick up your whole family and go and just leave on Erev Pesach in the morning and go for the first day of Pesach and for the Seder night and everything outside Yerushalayim and come back. But if you don't, what are you supposed to do? And he describes there were some families who didn't have any option to do, and they would all go down to Motzah. Can you imagine a whole family on the busiest day of the year, Erev Pesach, finish all your preparations for Yom Tov, burn the chametz, finish all your preparations for Yom Tov before Chatzos, go down to Motzah, which is a few kilometers or whatever it is, and just hang out over there with no muktzah, nothing in your pockets, just wait there until it's Yom Tov, and then with your whole family make the trek back up to Yerushalayim, back home, and then do the Seder. I mean, that's a huge inconvenience and undertaking, and as you can imagine, there were many people who do not live up to that. And again, in my mind, it was always clear the Rebbe had this instruction here that you have to do it. From reading the Sikha and the letters, it doesn't seem like the Rebbe was saying one must do this. The Rebbe was suggesting, again, I don't want to say this authoritatively because, you have to ask to do some more research perhaps. But it seems like the Rebbe was making a suggestion of an appropriate chumrah, not something that absolutely must be done. And then for Pesach Sheni, it was less of a big deal because usually Pesach Sheni is the middle of the week. But he says he remembers he was talking here to one of the people who lived in Yerushalayim at the time, and he says he remembers that one year that his father, he's speaking here to Rabbi Shalom Ber Cohen, who lives in Nachla, that's in Kiryat Malachi, but his father, Baron Rothschild, lived in Yerushalayim. So he said for those few years, his father always came to him for Pesach. But for Pesach Sheni, so he just left Yerushalayim for the day. He says he remembers one time Pesach Sheni fell on Friday, and he says he remembers his father got ready for Shabbos in the morning on Friday and took the bus down to Motzah, just outside Yerushalayim, and he waited there until Shabbos, and then he walked back home. So interesting history. But again, I think sometimes people misunderstand and think that the Rebbe was saying that one can bring Karban Pesach nowadays. The Rebbe was not saying that at all. the Rebbe was saying that one may not bring Karm Pesach nowadays, but just in order to, because it's such a strict prohibition of kares, and there is this opinion, so we might as well do that chumrah to leave Yerushalayim to be choshesh for that shitta. Now, again, like I mentioned, the very fascinating correspondence, very long and interesting letter between the Rebbe, from Rabbi Zevin to the Rebbe and back, and the vast bulk of the letter is discussing whether or not this whole concept of leaving Yerushalayim is relevant to Pesach Sheni or only to the first Pesach. And like I said, when the Rebbe spoke about it, he was just talking about Pesach Sheni. He wasn't even talking about Pesach. And Rabbi Zevin was like, oh, why only Pesach Sheni? And the Rebbe said, no, I mean Pesach too. Why the Rebbe chose to speak about it Anachron Shal Pesach and not before Pesach, I don't know. But that's the bulk of that letter, is getting into the intricacies of the Gemaras and the Rambams, etc., to determine whether or not Derech Chayka, being outside of the walls of Yerushalayim, is relevant to Pesach Sheni, only to the first Pesach, and perhaps we will take a chance one day to learn that letter in depth. Thank you all for joining.